Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to it, and click that bell icon to get weekly reminders about our new episodes.
That's right. So, what we're going to be doing each week is we're going to be having a conversation, Todd and I, on the upcoming lectionary reading from the Gospels for the upcoming weekend. And our goal is to talk about that reading in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. And our hope is that our conversation will be just, as in justice, but that also something that we say during this time might inspire you along with us to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what are we looking at this week?
After a few weeks in Matthew 13, we've graduated to Matthew 14, and we're in verses 13 to 21 and the feeding of the 5,000. And so, Herb, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, it's a famous story where Jesus feeds the multitude with with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And as miraculous or out of the norm this story may seem to us in our post Enlightenment worldview, for the original Jesus community, especially those who were part of the Jewish community as well, this would have been a hearkening back to themes they were already familiar with. It would have been a
Hmm.
repetition, a re-emphasis of themes. So the one that comes to mind is Second Kings 4, 42 to 44. This is the story of Elisha, where a guy brings Elisha 20 loaves of barley, and Elisha says, give it to the people to eat because they're in a time of famine. And the guy's like, 20 loaves of bread, how far is that going to go? How can I set this before 100 men? He answered, and Elisha said, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat, and here's the catchphrase, and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left over according to the word of the Lord. And so we come to the Jesus story, and it's a repetition of stories like this where now Jesus is kind of another Elisha, where the people need something to eat, and he blesses this food, and and they share it, and it goes around to everybody, and they have some left over. So again, this would have in an oral tradition, an oral a community that was not literate the way we are today, where they would gather together and hear these stories being read to them. Um, these are the parallels that they would have picked up.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that Jesus was savvy about too, is again and again making connections between what he was doing as being either a fulfiller of prophecy that Jews had heard from the past, or re re reliving the stories of the Jewish people in new ways. And
Reenacting those.
yeah, so it was brilliant on his part of how he went about that.
Yeah, and whether it was him who did that or whether it was the authors that, not to get controversial, but the authors of the
Right.
Gospels that wrote this in, they're using old narratives, they're refreshing old narratives to teach ethical points in the Jesus community. I mean, what this story does for the Galilean Matthean community is emphasize the importance of not trying to go it alone as a community, but about resource sharing and mutual aid, and those who have more than what they need sharing with those who have less than what they need. It reminds me of I don't know, and Todd, if you've read this book or not, but it's a great book by Wilkinson and Pickett. It's The Spirit Level: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. And for those of you out there who aren't familiar, there's a YouTube video as well that he does. It's his TED Talk, and it's titled How Economic Inequality Harms Societies. But again, statistically, this has been proven over and over again. It's a universal truth that the path of life is not when we compete with one another to see who can have the most, but when we share, when people have more than they could ever possibly need, how we can share with one another to make sure everyone's taken care of. That even wealthy societies, the litmus test or kind of the barometer for whether those societies are life-giving or death-dealing is not their GDP or not even how much wealth the community possesses, but what is the gap? What is the measure of the gap between the haves and the have-nots? What is the level of income inequality that people that, and when that is shrunk, those societies seem to do better on almost all counts, socially, economically, politically, emotionally, psychologically, just a different society, different community. And so the early Jesus community is trying to foster this. And that makes sense. I mean, it was those on the margins economically, especially, that were drawn to the Jesus community because of
Right.
this. I mean, this was a way for them to survive.
Yeah. This is at, I don't really have anything to add to that other than that it's just clear that Jesus is really communicating this direction in everything that he does. And this is one of those passages where he just does it in a profound way. I mean, this is like his teaching magnified exponentially and saying, this is who I am, this is who I'm about. I'm going to heal your sick, and this is about, and our community should be caring for the sick, and our community should be making sure that everyone has enough. And
Mm-hmm.
this is just a magnification of everything that he's already been teaching.
And for those of us who live in a more naturalistic worldview today, and we look at this story and all we see is the miracle of the story, again, I just want to remind us that that's not what the original community would have seen. They wouldn't have even noticed it. I mean, stuff like that was so happenstance or just kind of normal in their worldview that these things,
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things could happen, that would have been kind of just glossed over. The point they would have taken from it is not the miracle. The point they would have taken is the importance of sharing, that when we share even the little that we have, when we all pool our resources together, there's more than enough for everybody. There's enough to go around, and we're going to have some left over even. I mean, it's what Gandhi taught, that each day the earth provides enough for each person's need, not every person's greed. That if we're experiencing a lack of abundance, it's because someone somewhere is hoarding resources. Yeah. And what I love too about this, Todd, is that Matthew, in the rhetoric that the Gospel of Matthew uses, it's tied into the later Eucharist story too. In Matthew 26, when Jesus takes the bread once again, gives thanks and breaks it. I mean, it's a repeating phrase, a reoccurring phrase here. This was, I think, I side with those Jesus scholars out there that say that this was the original purpose of celebrating the Eucharist, celebrating the Last Supper. That you had a community where in the Book of Acts, people who had more than they needed was selling their properties and bringing it to the apostles' feet and letting it be distributed, so there was no needy person among them. And this was kind of this is what the early this is what the possibly the early uh, commemoration of the Eucharist, the Last Supper, what we today call communion, some of us was. It wasn't a memorialization of like some penal substitutionary atonement. It stood for shared resources, shared bread, shared drink, where we're all coming together. It wasn't like a little wafer and a little 1 ounce juice cup. It was an actual meal that's shared. And whenever they would lose sight of that, We have an example of that in Paul's letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul really rails against them when he says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you're eating, even though they were calling it that. For when you're eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Man, that is a direct parallel to what we have today with the billionaire class and people that are just scratching by in America. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this manner. And then he goes on in verse 27 to say that when you forget to equate with this meal, that it's really about sharing your abundance with those who have lack. When you forget that, you're eating it in an unworthy manner, and quote unquote, you're guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. That's heavy economic justice language
Very much so.
tied to commemorating what Jesus was all about, which again, today's gospel is so much about Jesus died to get us to heaven. It's
Right.
not about resource sharing today. And the early Jesus community seemed to be 180 degrees on that. It wasn't about
Yeah,
heaven later. It was about creating heaven on earth here and now.
that's right. That's one of the hardest things for me with leading and officiating at a communion service is to expand it beyond the borders of just Christ's sacrifice, and to really help people understand that what what the symbol that's most important to me, honestly, is not the bread or the wine, but the table that it sits on. And to
Mm-hmm.
say, this table is what we're actually trying to get at, is this place where everyone, it's a big table, it's a solid table, it can handle all the food that's on it, can handle a lot more food than what's on it currently, and it can handle a lot of people coming and sitting around it, and we can all share together equally, regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of our economic situation. There's enough for everyone. It is, but it's so hard to take to break free from the confines of just being about the sacrifice of Jesus to what he's teaching here in this story, and what he's teaching in the Eucharist, and what the early apostles were doing in the book of Acts. Because you're right, it's so much bigger than just the bread and the wine.
Yeah, and the Didache actually backs that up. Certain scholars date the Didache as even being earlier than our New Testament, and
Mm-hmm.
so it was kind of like an early church manual. And when you read the words that the Didache says are to be spoken whenever the Eucharist is celebrated, it's not about the dying and the death of Jesus obtaining some ticket to postmortem bliss.
Mm-hmm.
It's about bread being shared. It's about wine being shared. It's about
Mm-hmm.
resources being shared, and it's pretty powerful. It's a paradigm shift for sure, because we don't use that language typically in the faith traditions that I grew up in. You're
Right.
right. We don't use that language at all when it's all about Jesus paid the price, rather than you know Jesus modeled a way for us to take care of each other.
Right. Yeah. It's 180 degrees from what we typically do.
And the last thing I've got this week is just a statement from John Dominic Crossan. Todd, I love this statement. I used it in my blog this week. When we talk about the loaves and the fish, even though it's the little that we have, yet we're sharing it with the community. It's not a individualistic focus, but a community focus. Um, and how when we do that, there's enough for everyone, and then some left over. In Crossan's book, The Greatest Prayer, Rediscovering the Revolutionary Message of the Lord's Prayer, this is at the very beginning, page 3 and 4. He says, "Do not, by the way, let anyone tell you that Jesus' teaching is liberalism, socialism, or communism." So right out the gate, he's acknowledging these associations. And he says, "It is, if you need an ism, Godism, householdism, or best of all, enoughism." And I love that term, enoughism. And then he defines it. We sometimes name that biblical vision of God's world household as egalitarianism, but actually enoughism would be a more accurate description. And he goes on to explain that enoughism is where everyone has enough to thrive, or no one has too much while have too little. We live in a society today, we practice radical individualism for the common person. And there are people in our society that escape the commitment to take care of others, whatever you want to call that, whether it's taxes or whatever. They find a loophole to escape participating in that communal aspect of society, the citizenship, and those people have more than they could ever possibly need in one lifetime. While at the same time in this country, we have people that are just don't even they have nothing. They just have nothing. They're struggling each day to survive poverty. I mean, it makes
Yeah.
me think of like children, especially here in West Virginia. We have food deserts in some of our counties where kids can't eat, especially in the summertime where there's no school. A lot of these kids, the only meal they get is at school. Um, and it makes me think of elderly people. Once they're past the years of productivity and capitalism, are we committed to still taking care of them? And there's movements afoot to get rid of Social Security and to get rid of um, different programs like that. It just calls into question all of that. What would society look like? And usually when Christians talk about shaping society, according to the ethics of the Jesus story, they begin talking about things like prayer in public schools and abortion and all that
Right.
stuff. But really, if you're going to be looking to shape society into something that is more representative of the kind of ethics we bump into in the Gospels, it's more socialistic than a lot of capitalists I think are comfortable with.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, it would look. I, yeah. I mean, I can imagine certain sectors of our society just uh, screaming out in horror at the idea um, that certain people who just get access to the hospital. Imagine getting access to the hospital for free or for almost nothing, so that they can be well. I mean, imagine what the atrocity that would be, that somebody who has no money gets access to healthcare. That would just, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. When I
terrible.
talk to my Canadian friends, they're like, I actually want to belong to a society where I may be paying a little more in taxes, but a lot less in healthcare. And at the same time, I am ensuring that the kid down the street can get the access to healthcare
Right.
that he needs.
Right. And that's one of the realities that anybody in healthcare will tell you about is the what actually happens in healthcare is that when people who don't have insurance come into an emergency room, the hospital actually is required to serve them. And so what happens is the hospital then incurs that expense. And then that causes them to, in order to make ends meet, raise the costs on services for everybody else who has the ability to at least pay a little bit uh, into towards their health care. And the healthcare expenses keep rising. And and if we would actually resolve the issue by saying, you know what, no, we're actually going to expect that not everybody can have their health care covered, and so we're going to build a system where everybody does have access, it would actually lower costs in a number of ways, because now it's built in to the system to care for everybody rather than ha- passing on the expenses of some people to, not to the hospital, not to the government, but to the rest of us. It would work out better if they would actually build a system.
It
for
actually
everybody.
makes more sense, more economic sense to move in that direction.
It does. It does. And the
Yeah.
same thing is true with, you look at all the food that is thrown away in this country, all the food, excess food that grocery stores and restaurants get rid of every day.
Or
That,
crops that farmers have to destroy to keep prices stable.
yep, there's so much out there that could be passed on and get to everybody if we just would focus on making that happen. It would, so many of our issues could actually be resolved if there was intentional effort put in that direction.
Yeah. And this conversation doesn't even begin to address the way, even when we try to move towards a more egalitarian system socially, politically, and economically, how we still pick on to for lack of a better term, we still choose to use our differences one from another to exclude some from that equality, to
Mm-hmm.
excuse some from that communal commitment to care. You know what I mean? We can talk all day. I'm thinking about the New Deal history and how it was a great thing for certain people, but for people of color, they were still excluded from
Right.
it. The Black community was excluded from it. So again, we need a intersectional approach to be practicing the kind of ethic that we read about in this week's reading. I mean, what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean for us to bring our two loaves and two fish? That guy they could have sat down and eaten that lunch and been just fine, been happy. But when they gave it to the community, following a community approach, a commonwealth approach, rather than an individualistic, isolated approach, to practice that kind of approach to society, for there to be some left over enough for everyone. What does that mean for us today who have any kind of wealth, whether it be social or economic or political or whatever a form of wealth we have? What does it mean to use our wealth in the same way as those 5 loaves and 2 fish, to use that wealth in an effort to build that kind of community?
Yeah.
What does that look like? And I don't have the answer to that, but those are the questions we need to be asking. Those are the kinds of questions that create a different world for us to leave to those who come behind us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, if we all kind of recognized the two the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that we each possess, and would start thinking about how can that be multiplied, how can that be magnified for the common good. That's where we
Not for
start.
me, not invested for me, so I can
That's
have
right.
more loaves and fish. How can I, build community with this?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So yeah,
So
it's
anything else?
again, I see this story as just reaffirming those ethics for the Matthean community. This was a central tenet of the early church in the book of Acts, even. I mean, the very first sign of conversion, those of means, exemplified or exhibited as soon as they made a decision to follow Jesus in the book of Acts. The very next thing they did was those who had more than what they needed, they gave it to the community.
Yeah.
They gave their loaves and fish.
Yeah.
It's a
That's,
very different take on what Christianity means today, I know, but I think there's life in trying to get back to it.
yeah. No, that's that. If you're looking to try to get back to something that looks like the original ethos of Jesus and the early community, that's it. It was resource sharing. It was everybody taking care of each other in the midst of a a corrupt empire and an impotent and fraudulent religion. In the midst of that comes a group of people living out the heart of the kingdom of God right in their midst, in the resource sharing that took place.
Yeah. 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 Roger, Woodley, Randy, what? It's an R. His first name begins with an R. Woodley. It's the book that we recommended this month from Renewed Heart Ministries recommended reading on indigenous theology. But he talks about that, where Um, Christianity today is so wedded to empire. It became wedded to empire in the 4th century, 3rd century, and it's never been able to unwind it. He's asked, can you be a Christian today and still follow Jesus? He said, it's not impossible, but it is more difficult. I love that. It's not impossible. You can still be a Christian and follow Jesus, but it is going to be more difficult.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, all right, man. You got anything else, Todd?
I don't. I think that's a good place to end. Um, as discouraging as it is.
No, I think it's encouraging. What are your loaves and fishes? What are your loaves
Yeah.
and fishes? What do those look like today? What can you give to the community?
Yeah. So,
All right, man.
all right.
Thanks everyone for watching. Todd, where can we find you?
Find me at toddjleonard.com or at glendalecitychurch.org.
All right. And you can find me at renewedheartministries.com and everywhere that might lead you.
All right. You guys have a great week, and we will see you soon. Take care.